Hello, and welcome to Episode 1 of Sarastro's Kingdom Death Monster painting series. In this episode, I'll be sharing my approach to painting the Prologue Survivors from Adam Poot's Kingdom Death Monster. The starting survivors are incredibly dynamic and expressive miniatures, alone in a strange world with a simple lantern and a shard of rock to defend themselves against the horrors of the surrounding darkness. The lanterns themselves are extremely evocative both thematically and aesthetically, and the figures lend themselves to a wide range of creative interpretations, especially concerning the handling of light and shade, and this video aims to present just one approach among many in that regard. Let's take a look at a brief summary of my approach to painting the survivors from Kingdom Death Monster. I'm going to prime the miniatures in black, followed with a directional spray of grey and white to help map out the shadows and highlights. I will then apply the base colours, and I'll be using some wet blending to roughly block in the main areas of light and shade. Next we'll apply some more refined highlights and shadow tones to push the contrast, and I'll be imagining a slightly colder, more ethereal overhead global light to contrast against the warmer glow of the lantern. We can then finish the miniatures off by adding some optional facial details and painting the base. For practical reasons, this video will focus on Zachary and Lucy, but the same colours and techniques can of course be applied to Allister and Erza, and I'll be including details of alternative colours for the hair in the video description. Let's begin. I've chosen to prime the figures with Vallejo's black surface primer. I won't be covering the assembly in the video simply because I glued mine together some time ago, but I will include links to some useful building guides in the video description. I'm now applying some cold grey from above to provide some global highlights, or zenithal highlights, that we can use as a guide when applying our own highlights later on. I'm also now applying this from the direction of the lantern to give us a sense of the object source lighting, which I'm going to be pushing quite aggressively in a while. Finally, I'm using some dead white to reinforce the light being given off from the lantern. This will be particularly useful when painting the stony base. We can see that this process gives us a useful pattern of light and shade that we can use as a reference when painting the miniature. If you don't have access to an airbrush, then a simple prime in grey or black with a brief spray of white from the direction of the lantern should give a roughly similar result. We're now ready to apply the base colours. I'm going to begin by painting the skin, and I'm going to create an initial impression of light and shade by using two contrasting tones. For the darker sections of skin, I'm using Bugman's Glow mixed with a little dark sea blue. And for the lighter areas, I'm using Cadian Flesh Tone, which I'm desaturating with some Administratum Grey. Here I'm mixing the darker tone. Because I'm going to wet blend the tones on the miniature, I'm also mixing in a few drops of Vallejo's glaze medium, which I like to use because it extends the drying time. And here I'm mixing the lighter tone. Working one section at a time, I'm now going to use the darker tone to block in the main areas of shadow in relation to the position of the lantern, ignoring any global lighting for the moment. I'm now blocking in the lighter tone. We can then give the brush a quick rinse and a wipe before blurring the border of the two tones whilst the paint is still wet. Additional paint may of course be added if the finish looks a little thin. I'm now carrying on round the rest of the miniature in the same way. and I'm using the same colours for the rest of the survivors. Once dry, I'm going to do a little refining, and there's nothing wrong with mixing an intermediate tone to help smooth over any harsh transitions. Before moving on, I've chosen to block in the main colour for the lanterns to help us better judge the colour and intensity of our lighting. I'm going to firstly provide a solid white undercoat, and I'm using Schminker's Titanium White. This will just help us achieve a brighter yellow tone in a moment. And I'm now using Yriel Yellow to colour the windows of the lantern. I'll return to do some more work on the lanterns later on. I'm now going to paint the areas of cloth, and I'm going to create a gradient using Dark Sea Blue, Mechanicus Standard Grey, Deck Tan and Yriel Yellow. I've chosen to use a wet palette for this. I'm once again mixing in a little glaze medium to extend the drying time when the paint is on the figure. I'm now using these tones to once again quite loosely block in the areas of light and shade. Just as with the skin, I'm treating the lantern as the only source of light for the time being. We'll be returning to refine the cloth later on, so it's okay if things are a little loose and sketchy at this point. This completes the two main areas of colour on the miniatures, which means we can now begin adding some more refined highlights and shade. I'm now going to begin highlighting the areas of skin that are illuminated by the lantern. To do that, I'll be returning to my paler base tone, Cadian Flesh Tone and Grey, which I'm going to incrementally lighten with the addition of some white and Yriel Yellow, and a hint of Fire Dragon Bright. Here I'm mixing in a little orange, followed with some yellow, and now some white. My typical approach to highlighting smooth areas like this is to lay down a thin layer, keeping the brush moving mostly in line with the contours of the body. We can then use a damp brush to smooth out or feather the edges of the highlight. I'm now lightening the tone with some additional white and yellow in a few stages. There's a good chance we'll hit some of the cloth whilst doing this, which is fine since we'll be doing some more work on those areas later on. We naturally want to exaggerate the highlights the closer we get to the lantern. It's possible to make some broad but subtle adjustments to the brightness and hue through the use of a glaze. Here I've chosen to brush on some thinned orange to warm up the tone slightly. I'm just looking to provide a gentle filter of colour, and it's important that we don't let the glaze pool. Thin glazes like this will also help give a more blended look to the layers of highlight. I've also chosen to provide a yellow boost for the areas that are closest to the lantern. I've highlighted Zachary and the other survivors in the same way. Notice that because of the position of the lanterns, there is a lot less skin being hit by the light for Zachary and Allister. I might be stretching things slightly with these highlights on the face in the interests of aesthetic gain. We can now turn our attention to the areas of skin that aren't being lit by the lantern. I'm going to begin by darkening the shadows by mixing some Dark Sea Blue and Naggaroth Night into some Bugman's Glow. Here's my Dark Sea Blue and Naggaroth Night mix, which I'm now adding to the Bugman's Glow. I'm then using this to begin pushing the depth in the shadows. I'm now darkening the tone further in a couple of stages. Once again, you'll often see me use a damp brush to feather the edges, especially for larger areas of shadow like we can see here on the back. Here I'm using the same shadow tones for the unlit areas on Lucy. For the deepest shadows, I'm going to mix some dark sea blue with some black. I'm now going to provide some gentle highlights for these areas by mixing some Sybarite green and a little white into the original Bugman's Glow and Dark Sea Blue base tone. I've chosen to use green in these highlights because I wanted to give a slightly ethereal luminosity to the global lighting, but you could add a hint of whatever colour you like. Pale lilac or blue, for example, would be fine. I'm applying the highlights with caution because I don't want them to compete with the highlights created by the light of the lantern. You can see how thin my consistency is, especially for these larger areas of skin. I'm now gently increasing the amount of green and white in the mix in a few stages. this is as bright as I'd like to take these highlights. I'm now going to paint the hair, and for Zachary, I'm using a gradient of Steel Legion Drab, Rhinoxide, Dark Sea Blue, and Black. You can see that I'm using the warmer, lighter brown tones for the front right section of the hair. Notice that the paint is thin enough to allow the raised texture to stand out. I'm now painting Zachary's lower lip. Next I'm going to provide a few highlights, firstly by mixing in some Deck Tan and Yriel Yellow for the right side of the head and beard. Here I'm using the side of the brush to more easily hit the raised texture on the beard. And I'm now mixing in a small amount of Sybarite Green for the darker side of the head. For Lucy's hair, I'm mixing some black, dark sea blue and Naggaroth Night. Once again, this is thin enough to allow the raised strands of hair to stand out. I've chosen to deepen the contrast further by applying a roughly equal mix of Nuln Oil and Drakenhof Nightshade. I'm also using this to selectively darken the left side of Zachary's hair. I'm now going to brush some Lamenter's Yellow onto the front of Lucy's hair to create some simple yellowish highlights. And I'm mixing a little Sybarite Green and Deck Tan into the base tone to provide a few gentle highlights to the back of the head. Next I'm going to paint the lanterns using the scale colours Black Metal. You could use pretty much any dark metallic tone you like for this. I'm now going to shade the entire lantern with some Cassandra Yellow. And I'm now mixing a little white with some Yriel Yellow and using this to add a rough highlight within each window. I'm letting some of this hit the metalwork to give the impression of light spilling out. We can now return to the sections of cloth, and I'm using the same set of colours as before, except I'm adding some black for the darkest recesses. I'm doing some general refining and neatening up, whilst pushing the contrast a little further, both in the shadows and the highlights. I might also mix in a little Sybarite green to highlight the parts of the fabric that are facing away from the lantern. We're now ready to add some finishing touches. I'm now going to paint the eyes using ivory. Next I'm going to thin some black ink with a roughly equal measure of water. I'm then going to drop some of this into each eye, soaking up any excess with the brush if necessary. The hope is that the ink finds its way into the recesses that surround the eye, giving us some fairly easy edge definition and also creating the impression of the ink described in the narrative. I'm now going to use some black to give Lucy some pupils, but we'll be leaving Zachary's much smaller eyes as they are. And I'm also using this to paint on some streaks to represent the streaming ink. Next I'm going to mix some Screamer Pink and Doombull Brown, which I'm applying quite thinly to introduce some colour to Lucy's lips. Once we're happy with the figures, we can go ahead and paint the base, and I'm starting by using some black, white and grey to paint over any parts of the base that have been accidentally hit along the way. I'm now going to use some Lamenter's Yellow to glaze over the illuminated parts of the base. And we can use a damp brush to feather the colour out the further away from the light source we go. And to remain consistent, I'm painting the individual shards in the same way. I'm now mixing equal measures of Cassandora Yellow and Lamian Medium, and I'm repeating the process. This is just to increase the level of orange and introduce some tonal variation. Finally, I'm going to thin down a mix of black and dark sea blue. You can see here the rough consistency that I'm looking for. I'm then using this to colour the more shadowed side of the base, once again thinning the paint out as it moves towards the light. We can then paint the rim of the bases with some pure black. Finally, before protecting the miniatures with a spray of dull coat, I've chosen to give the lanterns a final boost with some white mixed with Yriel Yellow. And this completes the Prologue Survivors. Thank you for watching. I do hope you have enjoyed the video. Don't forget, you can find details of the colours used for the hair of Allister and Erza, along with links to my social media accounts in the video description. My very special thanks as always go to the amazing patrons for funding this work. I simply couldn't do it without them. Join me again soon as we continue painting miniatures from Kingdom Death Monster. Happy painting!